Hey guys, Mrs. Karaz here. Today we're looking at Chapter 4, Section 3, Slavery in the Colonies. Alright, so we know from what we've seen in previous chapters that the first slaves in America were brought by the Spanish and Portuguese. Later, the British, Dutch, and French became involved in the slave trade. And slave traders set up camp on the coasts of West Africa and often made trips to the interior in order to kidnap and enslave people. And between 1500 and 1800, over 10 million enslaved Africans were brought here to the colonies and later the United States of America, because that time period covers a lot of our history. So let's start with the Middle Passage. The Middle Passage is the journey to the Americas that enslaved Africans had to endure, right? It's the trip from one place to another. So typically up to 350 people could be transported in one journey, and often the way they were transported was by being tied up below deck without much light or air. And due to these conditions, 15 to 20% of Africans died during the Middle Passage. And those deaths were either natural due to how terrible the conditions were, or through suicide, because people did not want to endure the life that they knew was coming their way sometimes. Some captains of these slave ships pushed for better conditions, but let's not applaud them just yet, because really they wanted better conditions, because they were hoping that more Africans would survive the journey, and then they could make more money by delivering more of the product that they were selling, for lack of a better term. So while that seems like a nice thing, people looking for better conditions on these slave ships, I don't know that the motives were indeed so pure. So now let's look at triangular trade. The triangular trade system was a three-way trade between the colonies, the Caribbean, and Africa. And I really should say the English colonies, right? Because we know that there are Spanish colonies in the Caribbean at this time. So ships from New England carried fish and lumber to the Caribbean, and the Caribbean gave us sugar and molasses. Ships from New England carried rum and guns to West Africa, which are then traded there for enslaved Africans. And then we have ships from West Africa sailing to the Americas in order to sell slaves. So I'm noticing a lot of vices here, right? A lot of the things that people probably shouldn't be purchasing or using. Nothing that much good is going to come out of being traded in these circumstances for each other. I wonder if that will lead to bad things. So now let's look at how slavery really evolved here in the colonies. So we looked already at the breakdown between the different colonial regions. So mostly in the South, right, we have plantations cropping up. Pun slightly intended, not really. And plantations were large farms developed around crops that needed to be tended by many workers, right? Things like tobacco, things like cotton that we've looked at previously. These crops that you could make a lot of money off of, but you needed a lot of people to tend to them, right? They're not going to take care of themselves. So because the demand for labor on plantations was so high, plantation owners often turned to slaves as a source of free, permanent work, right? Servants and indentured servants weren't seen as good enough because they're expensive, you have to pay them in some capacity, and they're temporary, right? A servant could go find another job any day of the week. An indentured servant would have to work off their contract, but again, eventually they will be free and they can move on. And, working these crops is hard work. It's not something you're probably going to want to do for your entire life. And you might think, as a plantation owner, right, morally speaking, wouldn't you rather pay someone a decent wage for doing this hard work so you could sleep at night and not feel terrible about yourself? Well, yes, but sometimes money is the bottom line, right? So if you can charge $5 for a pound of cotton and you have to pay your worker $1 for every pound of cotton that they pick, right? That means there's $4 in your pocket. If you don't have to pay them at all, there's $5 in your pocket and you've just increased your profit. So is it a moral system? Obviously not, right? I don't need to tell you that. But economically, slavery was a system that worked out for plantation owners. And we're going to see that economic focus is going to drive us, not only through the evolution of the colonies into the United States, but through the Civil War and beyond. All right, so it's important to know that originally not all slaves were enslaved for life. In some ways, slavery began similar to indentured servitude, in that you could earn your freedom or buy your freedom after X amount of years. But that system begins to change when people become really dependent on slave labor. So looking at some laws that had, influenced this. So in 1639, Maryland passed a law that said if you were baptized, that doesn't make you free, right? Just because you're tied to a religion has nothing to do with your freedom or enslavement. In 1663, Virginia legally declares that any child born of a slave is also a slave. Rhode Island had a slavery ban, but eventually it was lifted because the state realized it could make a lot of money by shipping slaves there in New England. Georgia had a ban on slavery actually until the 1750s, but ultimately that was lifted too. So eventually all colonies really had slavery at one point or another. But like we said, it's really those plantations with those cash crops that feel like they need slaves to get by. And that's why we'll see the desire for slavery clinging on in the South long after it kind of fades in the North and Middle colonies. All right, so looking at resistance to slavery, often people will ask why, why didn't slaves just rebel? Why didn't they refuse to work? They did all the time, but there are obstacles left and right where, slaves are put in a position where if you rebel, you're, risking your life very seriously. So the first serious slave revolts occurred in Virginia in 1663. The rebels were betrayed by people that they trusted and punished publicly, okay? Remember, slavery was all about dehumanizing people and really creating this fear that, you're in a completely unfamiliar territory, you have no options, and that the punishments can be gravely severe for not listening to these people who are, your captors. So there are physical threats. We also have legal restrictions to what slaves can do, and these are called slave codes, which are laws that restrict the rights of slaves. So these develop in many states. They differ slightly from state to state, but some of the biggest slave codes said that slaves could not meet in large numbers, right? Because if you meet in large numbers, you could make plans, you could talk, you could stage a revolt with many people, right? So no, small groups only. Slaves couldn't own weapons. That one's pretty self-explanatory. Slaves couldn't leave a plantation without permission, right? Because who's to say you're not escaping, right? If the law says you have to have permission to leave and someone's walking around without permission, well, that person may have escaped. They have broken this code that we have in place. And one of the biggest ones were that slaves could not learn to read or write. And if we think about this, right, when you're educated, that opens opportunities for you, that opens doors. Plantation owners at this time wanted as many doors as possible to be closed for people who were enslaved. They wanted to keep them helpless and opportunityless. This one is always a punch in the gut to me. So there was also a slave code guaranteeing that if a slave owner killed their slave, they couldn't be arrested for murder. Think about that. You have killed a human being, but it's not considered murder, because technically what you have done is destroyed someone's property. That makes me sick to my stomach to even say or think about. But so this is the extent that these are laws being included in our, from the beginnings of colonial times. It's showing how deeply rooted slavery is and how harshly drawn those lines are between people who are enslaved and people who are free. And it's going to take a very long time to shake to erase that line, and we might say it's still not fully erased today, but that is a conversation we will continue over the next year and a half. Last but not least, and I know I've mentioned this previously, so often the textbook will end with, like, hey, here's an optimistic thing, but, yeah, often things are bad. So here's the textbook trying to put a silver lining on things. So only 10% of enslaved Africans lived north of Maryland. So that means 90% of slaves were located in the southern colonies, for reasons I've already explained. So now, in the North, there were very few slaves, but those slaves are allowed to take on more respectable jobs, and sometimes they were even able to work beside their masters. Over time, they might be able to buy or earn their freedom, like I said, because again, the need, and I'm putting need in air quotes, although you can't see me, for slavery is felt much more in the South than in the North. In the South, slaves didn't have the opportunities that slaves in the North had, but they did try to maintain some African customs and let their culture thrive is the wrong word because it's not, capable of thriving with restrictions placed on it, but do what they could to keep it alive. So slaves might speak Gullah, which is a special dialect. They might use African styles to create furniture and objects. Drum and banjo music came from Africa, and African folk tales actually became a part of African culture here in the colonies. We'll be looking at one such folk tale in class in the very near future. But for now, we will end this rather depressing slideshow. We only have, I believe, one more section left of this chapter, and then we'll be moving on forward into some pre-revolutionary goodness. So that is where I'm leaving you for today. Have a good afternoon, guys.